that pop up, they're going to pop up everywhere, you know, and how they have evolved over time. And when I was thinking, when you invited me to this event, I thought, how did that, so the promise of the sharing economy was about changing the system, you know, that we were living in, changing the operating system of our capitalism as we understood it then. And it's very interesting, and I want to throw this to my colleagues here in the panel, because at least my opinion is that the sharing economy evolved from a big promise to a massive defeat, in the fact that the capital sort of ate up that all these movements that were happening and evolved into the platform economy that we know today, where platforms are unable to really be so extractive, no, and winner takes all. So it's very interesting for me how a network can become something that stops being aligned with our values and not bring about the system change that we were hoping for, right? So I started in networks with this, then we lost that fight, and now we're looking for different fights in different networks. But I don't know how my colleagues think about all this, the age of networks. June, you're smiling.
Well, you know, I think that part of the thing is that we can't just, we know now that an organization can't by itself change a system. And so people have started to think, okay, it takes a network to start changing systems. But I'd say that it takes networks of networks. And that's what didn't happen with the sharing economy. Is there, if you think of everybody that's working from, you know, these new values of how we relate, and having them all be networked together, thinking strategically, doing a sets of experiments, raising the resources so that we can develop our own platforms for a different kind of sharing. And I don't think that, you know, it's starting to happen like in the food system area in the US. You know, there's a food policy, a National Food Policy Council network that's networking all the state policy, food policy councils and the local ones, but they're not connected to food entrepreneurs who are working in new ways, or you know, people who are developing new kind of food distribution systems. So, you know, I just urge people that let's think about the sector that you're working on and who else is out there. Are you really connecting with them? Are you really networking with them? Are you working strategically with them on looking for opportunity spaces for shifting systems?
So many comments on people mentioning education, no?
And that's another one. There's just starting to be networks. There are a few networks of networks on education, but you know, it's still early days. So just encouraging everybody to, you know, push your edges, spend more of your time reaching out to other networks that are working in this space.
I would like to add on that, because I think it's also about what are the values that tie those networks, or what are the principles, or the view of reality. Because you share about, you know, the sharing economy and start maximizing capital, and I think it gets down to what are the values and what is our view of reality, and what is our paradigm, and this change of paradigm that we're seeing in the world, where we're moving from just maximizing growth to maximizing well-being in society. So I think when we talk about networks, we also need to take a step back and talk about what are the values that drive those networks, and is there an alignment around those values that drive these networks?
We're talking, you know, Manel, I was thinking about all the networks I've had the privilege of being part of, or being part of supporting and leading. And some of them were, whether it was 100 Million Lives, were global networks across sectors. And June, what you said about the importance of connecting, and Linda, what you said about that values alignment, all of, like, there's a set of things that you need for networks to actually flourish, and for things to go from a general knowledge or existence in some sharing to actual collaboration. But the other thing that I thought so much about is the value of networks in shifting our common understanding about how we create systemic change. And Manel, your example of the sharing economy reminds me of a network I had the privilege of being a part of, which is the Leading Causes of Life Global Fellows, where it's social change leaders around the world sharing actually their very real stories of the heartbreaks of trying to do real systemic change and understanding where in fact they succeeded. For example, in South Africa, I mean, when you talk about a systemic change in terms of getting rid of apartheid, reconstituting the government and a new constitution, a new terms, that is systemic change. And the heartbreak of learning when capital it took over, when they learned that actually that wasn't still the root cause, and how valuable it was to learn that. Just this insight of what you shared and what I learned there. And so I think that there's a different kind of value of the act of networking that isn't just about the connections to do a what, but that are about the deeper connections to learn, to reflect, to understand the limits of what we don't know, to understand from our failures, and to be willing as social change agents to be changed in the process of creating change. That I think is a kind of network building that we need to lean into in this next phase of our growth. So I've been thinking a lot about that recently.
And so I'll jump in here. So I work for an organization called Tamarack, and we actually support networks, right? So communities that are working collectively to drive change forward. And we've had the privilege of being engaged in this work for 20 years. And I think you're absolutely right. It is about the learning and the sense making together with the partners who are driving the change at the place level, to see what patterns emerge, right? So you need to kind of not only have the network partners engaged in the work, but then the patterns lift up, and then those present opportunities to go deeper, to drive change forward, to see where maybe some of the gaps are, but also to understand that in each of the places where change is happening, local context matters, right? So to be flexible and fluid within that local context, but from those local contexts, you actually understand, you begin to understand patterns. And, I think we don't have enough stories of purposeful impact around what networks are achieving together. And so one of the stories in Canada is that, the work of our Communities Ending Poverty Network, when we started 20 years ago, poverty was at 16%, and now it's at 6.4%. And were our networks the only contributors? Absolutely not. But we worked in parallel with so many other players across the country who are contributing to this work. And you need those kind of powerful impact stories as well. Both what is happening in the network as it's moving forward, but what is the impact that is happening overall from the individual and collective efforts of the partners who are engaged in the network, and who are the other contributors. So, I think when you're working at in an area of like the sharing economy, there are the people that would be in the network and the contributors in that, but there probably are affiliated contributors who are maybe outside of the network or don't even know about the network yet. And so how do we look at the broader ecosystem of possible contributors? And if we truly want to make shifts, start with our network, but also understand that ecosystem and how to leverage the ecosystem for change. And those are some of the lessons that we've been learning at Tamarack as we have been, engaged in this work for, a number of years.
Can I be a bit provocational for all of us? We talked about networks as if networks was a thing, right? And there were other things which are not networks, right? So does it make sense? I mean, maybe it's not about networks and not networks. It's about when you do things to think as a network or think in network dynamics. Okay, can we say network thinking, like design thinking, but network thinking?
You know, Manel, I would say we talk about networks as a platform for system change, right? That's our inquiry here in some sense. And I think that belies the reality that what holds systems in place are networks of relationships and access and privilege and et cetera. So it's a reality whether we choose to recognize it or not. And I think
so networks are in systems. Now, Russ, how do we, an individual, how do we operate the network, right? How do we influence the network for that change that we want?
I think sometimes putting people into relationships with others whom they haven't been in relationship with is the most powerful intervention we can do. Like an example is,
it's a bit meta.
we were working on a grade level reading initiative here in the States, and one of the most powerful leader in the community, the most wealthy, kind of the kingmaker in the county, participated in one interview with a single mother around reading. He had assumed that she wouldn't have books, that she didn't value reading, that she didn't take the time to read with her kids. In one interview, all that stuff went out the window. Ooh. And a year later, he stood up in front of 300 people in the community and said, I was wrong. I thought I had the answer. I thought I knew what was happening. And in 1 hour, all of that got blown out of the way. He had never been in relationship with somebody who was in that situation, and so never had understanding or empathy about it.
Sorry, so many questions come to my head.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you raise, Russ, is that in designing that relationship, it has to be with people that you aren't necessarily in relationship with over and over again. Because when, there's that famous saying that when we're in relationship with the people that we know, we're going to create the same solutions that we created before, and they're maybe not as powerful as they could be. But when we're in relationship and dialogue, with people with lived and living experience, of the sharing economy. So the people who are outside of the sharing economy, for example, or in their own ways are sharing, but we wouldn't necessarily consider that traditional economy sharing. If we engage folks with lived experience, we call them context experts at Tamarack. If we engage them, it actually gives us this 360 lens that is so powerful in terms of where the points of change can really happen and the points of intervention in a network can really happen.
I'd love to hear from Vishal about, because I think
this coming
have a lot to say about this.
Thank you, Jill. So I've just been listening to all of you, and I picked up some of the pointers for me. One aspect of I think the key inquiry, why does systems change require networks, is because when we're attempting systems change, we are shifting a dominant narrative to a new narrative, and that cannot happen through an individual or an organization. It requires a collective to come together to shift narratives. And in our own experience of being part of education-focused networks, a key learning has been a key aspect of operating in a network environment is the transformation and the mindset shift we need to see within ourselves first. In my own experience, having grown up in a highly colonial education system, which taught me only about individual achievement and competition and success as an individual, I am not naturally wired to collaborate and network, which means I need to let go of my sense of I need to win, I need to succeed, to we need to win, we need to succeed. And that required me to rewire my own thinking, my own mindset, and to see how working in a network environment could actually create bigger impact. Now, 15 years of running Dream a Dream, our organization in India helped us realize that we as an organization will not be able to solve the education crisis in India. And if we think we can, it's hubris, which means we had to let go. So second key principle of networks is to let go of our own agenda. Because only when we learn to let go of our agenda, we can embrace a different agenda, or we can embrace someone else's agenda. And together we can probably create a new agenda. So letting go, working on ourselves, shifting our own dominant narratives, moving into more collective being, being collaborative, becoming collaborative, acting collaboratively. It's a skill, it's a muscle that one has to develop. And the last point I want to make is, I think a key aspect of networks and why some networks are more successful than others is how much time we invest in building trust. And that takes time. And you know, someone beautifully said it, especially in networks and collaboratives, we need to move at the speed of trust. And if you move towards outcomes much faster than we build trust, it's likely that conflicts will arise, and we wouldn't know how to come out of those conflicts or deal with those conflicts or respond to those conflicts and jump into our own old habits and agendas. So that's what I'm picking up from what I've heard so far.
And that kind of takes us to the kind of leadership that you need and shifting systems through networks. And I think, you know, a lot of how we change, it's really hard for us to change and act in these new ways and learn these new skills you're talking about, Vishal, by ourselves. And so the importance of when we do projects or experiments, that we have the leadership in them that helps us practice and learn some of these and co-create some of these new ways of being together, so that we do what I call micro processes, where, you know, we do a go round so everybody gets a chance to be heard, and a good facilitator who's maybe a half a step ahead of us is helping us. Let's try this process, and then we talk about it and how it felt, which is usually really good, and then talk about how to take it out into the rest of, because we have to be thinking about how this stuff spreads. And we've got to take it from work groups that we're in out to the rest of our lives, you know, work lives and our other lives.
June, when you think of networks, when you say networks, are you thinking mainly communities, or are there there's something beyond communities that are also networks?
Oh yeah,
I think Shomova has a great distinction there.
Go ahead, Russ.
I mean, well, I mean, two things. One, I think, Vishal, what you described is everything we've learned, both thinking about communities at like really effective community change. Communities act like networks and actually behave that, and then they become connected to one another and connected to others who are trying to create shift to create this broader we that can learn together. And there's things that you need to do for infrastructure, but fundamentally, I think this what we've learned in our work at We in the World and WIN is that adopting a way of being as well as a way of doing is essential, so that we don't perpetuate the system as it is, because to think we are not affected by those systems of colonialization and racism and classism is folly. And we actually need to do our own work to, as we would say, I think Russ put in our framework for action in the chat, but this idea of that we need to transform from within, transform together, including who we're in relationship with, that county leader with that mother, to shape and think what that looks like, and then to think in together to think about how we shape our outcomes, policies, and systems. And to your point, Liz, of, you know, things moving at the speed of trust, what we've often learned is that the more quickly we create the opportunity for people to share with one another directly, the more quickly things spread. And that often it's that relationship building between whether it's national groups, but also local communities creating change and seeing the creative, trusting that leadership that will emerge, and then giving a little fuel behind the things that are emerging that work. We've seen outcomes that achieve 50% or better. And that in fundamental ways calls us to reshift our ways of thinking, how change happens, how things spread in networks, how things get scaled, but also what our role is in the process of scaling, not to be the solution bringers, but to be the ones that are creating the space for the growth of leadership and the support of others.
Yeah, and I would say like transforming the way we see things, or the way we see the world in reality, is key. Because if we approach problems the same way, it doesn't matter if we do them differently, if we approach them from the same lens. And I think this inner transformation is connected to what Russ was saying earlier, the fact that the world is a network of connections, of patterns or interrelations. And I think we all need to come to the realization that if even in terms of the language we use, we need to change our language. We need to stop speaking about impacted groups, because what impacts others impact us. We need to stop talking about inclusive cities as if they are our cities and we're making them inclusive for other people. And I think we need to recognize that everyone's perspective is valuable and they can all contribute for the good of all, for transforming societies and communities for the good of all. So there is this beautiful poem by a Vietnamese monk called Interbeing, which I greatly recommend to all of you who don't know it already, who talks about the need to include a new verb in our dictionary, which is interbeing, which reflects this view about seeing life as a network. Capra talks about it as the web of life, right? As his book is called.
Can you share a link to that, Linda? Do you have a link?
Yes.
I love that, Linda. You've intrigued me.
You know, Shamava, what I was thinking of too is the distinction you've shared of strong tie networks and weak tie networks. And I don't think in any of our work, it's just one or the other. In our work at CoCreative, we really focus on strong tie networks. So specific purpose-built multi-stakeholder collaborations, we've supported probably 50 or 60 of those at this point. And each of the representatives in that network represents a whole network of other relationships and weak ties. And, you know, often people are joining just temporarily and bringing some new perspective or whatever. But it strikes me that with what Vishal was saying, with your evolution and your thinking, you didn't go in a closet and have that happen.
Yeah.
Right? That had to happen in relationship. And the thing I most love about networks, I think they're more effective. I think they're cheaper over time than other approaches. I think they're more efficient in terms of resources and time. But the thing I most love is the evolution that happens among people in a network. Like, we are changed by the experience of bringing our whole selves to the work, being in deep, trusting relationships around a greater shared purpose with other human beings. To me, that's the juice. I can make arguments about why they're better and more effective for systems change, but that's why I love networks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Russ. I mean, when we started moving from an organizational outlook to more a network outlook and started inviting in new ideas and new ways of thinking and being, and also expanding out our insights and, you know, kind of almost open sourcing a lot of our own insights into the world, what we started seeing is the narrative started shifting. So if a dominant narrative, for example, in education in India is that every child who goes to school gets good grades, goes to college, get good grades, will have a good life, which is true only for the top 15 to 20% who go to school. It's not true for the 80% who come from some disadvantage or vulnerability, but it's a dominant narrative. When we started working in networks and started co-creating a new narrative, which was around, say, how do we shift the purpose of education towards thriving for every child? And thriving is a more expansive definition than just academic excellence and jobs. We started seeing this show up in the larger environment, in the larger ecosystem, in policy documents, in blogs and articles, in research papers, in program definitions, in theory of change of organizations who are part of the network. So that's what happens. That when we work in networks, we co-create new narratives. We evolve our own thinking. We co-create these new narratives, and then these new narratives start becoming the norm or get mainstreamed. Which is very powerful. However, what we have to be careful about is that using a network-based approach to systems change, we are not pushing our own agendas and our own dominant ideas. We are really co-evolving, co-creating that.
Thanks, Vishal, and thanks everyone. As you saw, you've all seen in the chat, we are going to now take a pause. I love how these conversations just go so fast. And the speakers are going to, you already have a lot to read. And I think there's going to be a lot more that comes through. For about 4 more minutes, I'll put on some nice listening music and invite you just to type in chat. And since I unspotlighted everyone, this is also a chance to turn on your video if you're sitting back, and don't worry about if you're in your PJs or if you have a child around you, or if you're taking a walk outside. We want to see wherever you are. When you signed on, if you saw our sign-in screen, we embrace kind of whatever people's local realities and contexts are. So we'd love to see you. So enjoy the music, write in chat, and then in about 3.5 minutes, the speakers will absorb some of your comments and continue to reflect on them. feel free if you have any more thoughts for a minute or two to allow some more to come in through chat. Then we'll take another pause and we'll have more time at the end for some more chat interaction. And thanks everyone for all the comments. This is really great to read. I'm going to, if Liz doesn't mind, invite Liz to start us off. And Liz, I mean, maybe I'm sure you have other things that you want to contribute based on what was read, but there was one thing that stood out to me, a comment somewhere in there about kind of having this conversation feel a bit sometimes too theoretical and wanting practical and examples. And I know through your work at Tamarack all over the country, you have a lot of practical examples. So I was wondering if you'd be willing to start us out with providing some concrete examples of how you've seen this work, and then everybody else build on any other comments that you felt like you'd like to respond to.
Thanks, Brendan. Our approach at Tamarack is very context specific, right? So it really depends on the readiness of the folks in the network to be able to take on things. So we kind of look at things with a couple of lenses before we say, hey, here's what you need to do, and very much a co-creative kind of strategy as well. So we would look at things like readiness. We would think about complexity of the challenge that the community or the network is trying to lean into, or the opportunity that they're leaning into. We would think about what is the context, what is that narrative that you talked about, Vishal. I think that's such a critical factor, because every group that we've encountered or that we support or that we engage with, there are stories that we tell ourselves, right, about what is true, or at least true to us in this moment. And so uncovering those stories can be very helpful in terms of understanding what is positive about those stories that will help give leverage to the work that is unfolding, and also what is negative about those stories and what is holding the community back or the network back. And so uncovering that narrative and really leaning into that narrative in a very positive way is really critical. And then we think about, okay, so if we are in this place with you and in a space of co-creation, what are the tools, resources, practices, approaches that are going to be most helpful to you now? And it's not about a one size fits all. It's really about customizing to where that group is. And so, you know, Tamarack is, I often like to say that we're like butterflies, right? In some ways, we scan all of the practices of many of the folks in this room, Russ at CoCreative and June at the Network Weaver Institute, and many, many, many others. And then we think about, okay, so what's unique about that practice? And is that practice helpful in the work that we're trying to support unfold in different communities or with different networks? And we try at Tamarack, we try to also, from our individual and collective perspectives, from the 400 community partners that we've engaged in, what are they bumping up against all the time? And are there patterns? Are there ways of thinking that they're bumping up against, and how can we be helpful? And I think our approach is really much in service, right? In service, in a co-design framework, and in a learning, always in a learning framework as well. So, you know, that's our approach. It's not, there's tons of practical tools and resources. And if you want to go to the Tamarack website, rip off and duplicate them as much as possible, because we put them out there. We're absolutely, like a lot of people, where we open source all of our learning and practice. But Yeah, I think it like I would never want to say, hey, this is what you need, because I don't know your context yet.
And I just want to second the thing about spending lots of time on sense making, reflection, and learning. I just feel like we're missing so much stuff. And of course, because we're still in this dominant culture, kind of a prisoner, we're like a fish in water. We don't know how to talk about water. We need space where we're stepping back and really looking at what's going on and just noticing stuff that's going to make our next steps different, better, more innovative, breakthrough. So,
June, I want to build on that, and might be a bit provocative. For the longest time, we as a society have had a singular narrative of what success or impact looks like, which is largely a masculine narrative of speed. Let's do this, let's grow infinitely, let's keep growing, and let's do it faster and more efficiently and more effectively. And this has created a ton of problems for our world, including the big climate crisis that we're in the middle of right now. And if we shift that around and, what you're talking about, taking a step back, taking a pause, spending time in making meaning or making sense of things, being still and not in this constant zone of speed. This for me is the new kind of leadership that we need. A leadership which takes everyone along versus a leadership which just focuses on the end goal and wants to get to it whether people come along or not. So what we're seeing is a shift in leadership approaches. And I call this new leadership approach, which is about the pause, about taking people along, about spending time with creating meaning and spending time on reflection, is the feminine approach, because this is something that's more natural to a feminine style of leadership. So for us, increasingly, I think a realization that's emerging is that as we look at more network-based approaches to solve complex problems in our world, as we look at more network-based solutions to create new narratives for our world, what we also need is a very different approach to leadership. And we have to learn to let go of the old masculine approach of leadership and embrace the feminine approach to leadership, which is what you're talking about, which is what a lot of us are talking about, which is what we know is working in successful networks.
I might just shift that a little bit, Vishal. What we're learning in Canada is about Indigenous wisdom, which has always been part of the Canadian context, but certainly, as Tamarack works more and more with Indigenous nations, alongside of Indigenous nations, the wisdom of 7 generations, right? Planning this work for 7 generations is so critical, and the holistic approach is so critical. And I noticed in the chat box that there was a comment from someone in Australia as well. And I think, I think that the wisdom in our world, I agree there's the feminist approach, the feminine approach as well, but I think Indigenous wisdom is something that is environmental, is wisdom across generations, is about the whole person approach. And I think that we have to bring that wisdom and even more forward in terms of the work and the way that we show up in the world.
Yeah, and I also think that having this awareness that a lot of the challenges that we have today in terms of driving system change are characteristic of the modern Western culture, and I think we need to see that it's just characteristic of the way we see the world, the way we've been addressing problems in part, one by one, in isolation, and it's not a representative view of how everyone sees the world. And I do think Indigenous communities have so much to share and can be of so much inspiration. And we're seeing a convergence of even like modern science and ancient wisdom. And I just, it has to start with this looking at how we see reality. And I think with system change, sometimes the inclination is to jump into dissecting systems, mapping systems in a very analytical, rational way from this old paradigm of I'm going to dissect this system in parts and see where to intervene. Whereas I think system change is more about the way of seeing the world. It goes back to what Russ was saying about seeing the world as a network of connections, of patterns. And I even remember a conversation I had with Russ, maybe even last year, when he talked about insights into how to solve a problem will more likely come from conversations and engaging with people in conversation, as opposed to looking at the system and analyzing it or doing a causal loop diagram. And I think it has to do with what you've all been sharing about that system awareness of our interconnection and patterns.
Linda, in our work, what we've seen is that it needs both. But what we're often lacking is that deep understanding and relationship building and decolonization of our own mindsets, the adoption of different frames that were from before that time. And I think Indigenous frames, thinking about ways in which women, feminine forms of leadership, which by the way, women and men are equally capable of doing male dominant forms of leadership. So I think this is about really leaning into what we do if we do things differently. And if I could share like a couple of practical examples of some of this, one of the things we learned to do is think about how stories could become vehicles for understanding the system, and especially stories of those who have lived experience of the system. It turns out 7 good stories can give you about 90% of the quote unquote data, and much more effectively than 1,000 survey collections, because they show interconnections, things change over time, etc. So in a tiny community in Wisconsin, in Wyoming, which in the US context is a fairly conservative place, but where people believe in taking care of each other as neighbors, there was a problem with youth homelessness, where people had run away from their families. Almost certainly you don't run away as a youth unless there's something really bad going on in your family. It's just not a great, easy way to go about life. And so there was a goal to build a home for them, and this community collaboration came together, and they said, they got money to build a home, and then there was a huge "not in my backyard" response. And while this happens to be in Wyoming, this is true everywhere around the world in our work in the favelas in Brazil, in Tiger Bay in Guyana, like this is a common thing. And so one of the things this community had was what we call a community of solutions leadership structure that included those who were experiencing inequities, those who had some access to resources to change the system and an understanding of the system, and facilitative leaders whose real role was to mitigate those power imbalances, to allow the solutions to come forth and bring. So they didn't know what to do when things got shut down, and they brought it to this group. And the youth immediately said, "Of course you're having trouble. You're calling us homeless runaway children. Who would want them?" They were like, "Stop calling us that.
Who wants to be that?
Call that either." And so they said, "Well, what should we call you?" They said, "Well, how about like students? That's what we're trying to be." And they were like, "Okay." Unaccompanied students became what they did. But what they learned was, as the youth said what they needed to be effective, they realized how much leadership was there. And so they brought them into proximity with the broader group to actually share their stories and solutions. And in fact, what happened, of course, was that broader group of people went from seeing these as problem runaway children. A third of the people in the room had participated in that "not in my backyard" response. That flipped
to a how about in my spare room. These are our future community leaders, and we
Mm.
all need to be about
Beautiful.
supporting them. Within 6
Beautiful.
months, the solutions that the youth had suggested about stabilizing had led to a 50% reduction in youth homelessness. Within the next 18 months, this became a governor's initiative with policy change, because what the youth said is, take this time, instead of building a home where we're all here, think about how we're embedded in the community as a whole. Within 18 months, they had eliminated youth homelessness in their community. To do those second pieces, they needed to map the systems, coordinate and treatment. There were things they needed to do that required that systems thinking, but that's just in case it's helpful.
Thank
It's an
you.
example.
An
That's
amazing
cool.
example. Thank you.
I just wanted to respond. I think it was someone in the chat talked about the Indigenous learning with Indigenous folks. And I think that would be a great session. I don't think we could pull it off this month, but I think, and it wouldn't be the same people, but, you know, folks at Turtle Island Institute and Heredero and his team at Maori Futures Collective, there is so much learning to happen among and between communities there. And I just wanted to share, we're supporting a collaboration in Hawaii called Nakama Haloa. And I think one of the powerful realizations there is that the network, when people are connected in trusting relationships and they share a purpose and they're learning together, it is the system we want. It's not a means to an end. It's the embodiment of the system that the way we want it to be. And so I'm going to put in the chat here the draft new goal for this network from our convening a couple of weeks ago, because I think it really reflects powerfully that kind of realization.
I'm going to invite Manel to give us our last comment, but in the meantime, as you saw, you sort of shared in the chat, and I think you would just want to reshare. We love to close by asking everybody to reflect on one thing that they might actually practically do after listening to the conversation.
Hey, that was going to be my last comment.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Is that something that works for me when I go about my daily life, my work, is when I look at the project, I look at these 4 ingredients. One is openness. How open is it, or how open do I want it to be? And open being is a lot of things, no? Inviting others to participate, to discover, and so on. So how open is this project? How I'm bringing in informality, and that's the question about trust, right? How am I going to build trust? And the third one is experimentation, or a culture of experimentation in my work environment and the people I collaborate with. And finally, sharing knowledge, constantly working out loud and sharing knowledge, and, you know, encouraging others to take that knowledge and do something else with it. Right? So those 4 ingredients, for me, because I'm saying this because the whole thing about networks and systems can be so meta that sometimes you get a bit confused. So I always like to go back to these 4 ingredients to ground me. That's my last comment, Brendan.
Thanks, Manel, and thanks so much to all of the speakers. It always amazes me how fast these conversations go. And I just, as you're writing in chat, any action you might take, it could be like, I heard something Russ or Linda said that really inspired me. I want to experiment with that, or I want to read something or anything. We might follow up with you on that, because really our goal, as there were a few comments in here, is for these to be the sparks for a lot of new kind of mind shift and practice shifts, for us to kind of create new connections, and hopefully foster new collaborations. All of what we're trying to do is to really valorize this kind of network type and community type of work, which we don't think is valorized enough, and help people to understand it and to get deeper into it. We invite you to check out both Enact as well as a community that we run called Nexus, which is an open community for people who are trying to figure out how to do networks work. And I love to have us sign off, as a few of you know by now, with just before you close your screen and leave this Zoom room, to just unmute yourself and say bye, whether you're a speaker or a participant. So I'm just going to silence myself and just let everybody unmute and say ciao.
Thank
Thank
you.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye,
for
everyone.
joining us.
Thanks very much.
How
you.
interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Keep unmuting. There's still some people who didn't unmute and say goodbyes. Keep going.
Great session. Yeah.